would say, well, we're different, right? So we would disabuse of any risk equation because you can't put a quantification on what we do. We're so different and special. And when an executive sees that, they ask why. And so is it because we don't have the data? Are we not driving towards the right processes? What's the disconnect that you are so different from safety risk, from financial risk, from all the other risk types that we've been managing for, in some cases, hundreds of years?
This is very exciting. Joining me on the Unsolicited Response show is Jason Christopher. Jason has quite a background now, both in terms of ICS/OT security. He worked at EPRI, he worked at the Department of Energy, and then he sort of transitioned into the risk area, which is what we're going to talk about today. You were the CTO at Axio, where you did some data science, cyber insurance, and now, let me make sure I get your title right here, you are the Principal Cyber Risk Advisor at Dragos. So welcome to the podcast, Jason.
Thank you, Dale. Thank you for having me. I feel like I now hit the trifecta because I was able to teach for OnRamp. I was on the main stage, and now I'm on the podcast. So is this like a S4 bingo that I get to call at this point?
Well, even better. I keep calling it podcast, but now it's a video show. It's a YouTube show, so we've got it on podcast form. So you hit all four. So you're ahead of the game here. But I've been looking forward to talking to you about this because I would say for the last year or so, my obsession has been risk. Every time I get into a conversation with a peer, a customer, giving a presentation, just pushing back, well, what does this mean for risk? What does this mean for risk? Has really been, I guess, leading me to make better decisions or give better advice, I think. And I almost wish I had started pushing harder on this 10 years ago. So I think what you came up is really important. And you wrote a paper. The reason I have you on is you were the lead author of a recent paper called Industrial Cyber Risk Management, a guideline for operational technology, which is available to anyone, free download, so anyone can take advantage of this. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that. And let's maybe start with this concept of industrial cyber risk, because the paper spends some time to say, let's define these terms, and you actually say we should have this term called industrial cyber risk. Were we missing that term, or did you feel it was poorly defined? Why was that such a central part of the beginning?
So it's interesting because I do believe that it was something that we were missing out on, at least from a definitional side of things, because whenever we would talk to CISOs, they would find themselves talking about cyber risk, but it was always way more IT centric. Right. So it was conversations about how to secure their websites or their email servers, and less so about what was actually creating the dollars for the company, which is the industrial process. And so in sort of understanding that both the CISO and the VP of engineering and operations need to be at the same table, bringing those together by defining it as a new thing. I shouldn't even say it's new. It's existed, but having a definition around it that we can rally around for communication purposes, I think was really the purpose of driving that statement forward in the first part of the paper.
Well, you had me a little worried at the beginning because I thought you were going to fall into this trap of treating it as something unique and different rather than as a subset of business risk.
Yes.
But then towards the middle of the paper, you start to talk more about business risk. Maybe what do you see as the relationship between industrial cyber risk and business risk?
It's like a little nesting doll, right? It sits there in the center. So if I look at it, there should be the industrial cyber risk, and then there should be a larger component of all the things that we're doing for overall industrial risk. So safety, process engineering, and then build that out a little bit further. And then I can start seeing where the other business risks, business continuity, disaster recovery sort of frameworks will lie on top of that. But you're absolutely right. It fits within business risk. It's one of the things that I think is critical for a CISO to own, is to understand that they now own a portion of that business risk to keep the company safe. And that is now their industrial processes.
And we'll put it up on the screen here later in post-processing here, but your table 4, which I'm looking at here, really is where I stop being worried, because you break down things like I see a lot of organizations with the risk management program where they say there's a financial component.
Yeah.
There's a safety component, a business continuity, environmental, reputational, national, and then there's criteria for what makes, let's say, a financial risk a very high risk. If you lose this amount of money, and if you lose this range of money, it's a high, and so on and so on. And I guess I worry a little bit about when we talk about industrial cyber risk that the people involved don't map it to that business risk, because it
Absolutely.
almost doesn't matter. If you can't say this thing that happens in my industrial control system has this impact that the corporation views as a business risk, then it really doesn't matter at all.
Exactly. Why does it matter? And so, absolutely, sort of drilling through each of those components, and those components are unique for industrial, right? You're not going to go to a bank and talk about environmental impact from a cyber security breach on their behalf, right? So, very unique to us in terms of managing that, and it's mapped back to other ISA API standards that already exist that say this is how we do risk management. And so it was definitely a gap that we were seeing of, well, if you talk about that for risk management for the industrial processes, why aren't we doing that for the cybersecurity element of that industrial process? And so bringing that together, to your point again, for me, it elevates the CISO to being at the big boy table, right? Of all the other business risks, financial risk, safety risk, reliability risk, as opposed to here are the amount of vulnerabilities that we're tracking, or these are the latest threats that we're going through, without bringing it back to this. So what? Why does this matter for our organization at the end of the day?
And what I've seen, I'm sure you've seen the same thing, but the people in operations and sometimes the people in doing OT, whether they're coming from IT or from operations, really don't have a good feeling as to what's important to the organization. They might say, this control system goes down. If it goes down for 6 hours, it's the end of the world. It's a very high risk. And upper management says, it doesn't really matter to me. And then on the flip side, they might say, well, this labeling system for boxes for shipping isn't really that important. It's not that big deal. If that goes down for 3 days, nothing ships, and it has a big financial and customer impact.
Yep.
So I worry sometimes anytime we separate ourselves, and I know we have to look at it in our arena, but just that bridge to understanding business risk seems really important. And I guess to put that as a question to you, after I got through that beginning of your document, I would say a lot of this paper was really traditional risk management. I mean, in terms of the steps with maybe a 10 or 20% sprinkling of here's where it's a little different in the industrial world.
Yeah.
You've dealt with this. Is that how you view the situation, or what level of difference do you see?
There shouldn't be that much of a difference, right? Because, and that's, I think, actually been our discredit for a long time as cybersecurity professionals, not just in ICS, but I'll point on ICS in particular right now, that we would say, well, we're different, right? So we would disabuse of any risk equation because you can't put a quantification on what we do. We're so different and special. And when an executive sees that, they ask why. And so is it because we don't have the data? Are we not driving towards the right processes? What's the disconnect that you are so different from safety risk, from financial risk, from all the other risk types that we've been managing for, in some cases, hundreds of years? And I actually was tongue in cheek in the appendix of this, and I took out the ISO processes. There's an ISO 31000 series as well as the 27000 series. The 31000 series is just the generic risk model. And when you look at what 27,000 did, it basically added 2 steps in there. And the 2 steps were, are you sure you got this right? Are you really sure? And if you're not, go back to the beginning of this and do it all over again, because I don't know if you think you're sure about this. And so I was very tongue in cheek from that perspective. I do think that we need to treat ourselves as though we can teach risk managers to understand our stuff better. And simultaneously, we should understand their stuff better and not necessarily hold out a hand and say, no, we're different, we're special. Don't come near me with your risk equations. We can't handle that over here.
Just one other comment and question before we dive into it a little bit deeper here. I guess the comment was in the categories, the one category for business risk that I didn't see in your list, and maybe it's related to business continuity, was customer impact. And I've seen a number of asset owners, especially utilities, have that. For example, an outage and a power outage, electric outage of X amount of time is high to a certain percentage of customers. But it really, again, it really should be the business shouldn't be creating this chart, especially for the ICS world. They should already have it, and maybe they need to add something like environmental to it.
That's the rub, right? They should already have this. And how many security professionals we know that have actually leveraged this is the other question.
Yeah.
Somewhere
Yeah.
somebody's signed off on like an insurance policy that says, if we lose that turbine, we've got it covered, and it's X amount of dollars, X amount of outage days. This is how long we think it's going to take to get a replacement. And if you then ask the same security team, like, well, do you know what a turbine outage would look like at that facility? Maybe, right? The data already exists, and so how do we internalize it is one of them. And you're right. From the equation perspective of the different impact criteria in that table, it was definitely built into the business continuity piece. Or for some organizations, I've seen it, they take that and put it into reputational, right? Because for some, it may not even be that we lost, hundreds of customers. Us losing 10 customers could be, night and day, especially if we're in some sort of manufacturing sector. So I've seen folks play with those impact criteria a little bit to make it fit for what their executives care about.
Okay. And then in terms of the executives, you mentioned a little bit about the VP of engineering or operations and the CISO. What do you see as their role in, I guess, working through this and working with executives, the board, and risk management? How do they play together in this?
Yeah. So towards the end, it's a conversation about communication. So towards the end of the paper, one of the things that we sort of introduced was how to leverage a industrial cyber risk committee and making sure that all the right stakeholders are involved. And so that would obviously be engineering, but it could also be human resources. It could also be procurement, right? All those different elements of the sort of cyber security supply chain that we may experience, or our insider threats. All of those aspects should be essentially housed where maybe they're not the owners of the risk, but they're definitely stakeholders in it. And so the VP of engineering versus the CISO, if that's the role that it's at right now, it's really making sure that the stakeholders are all involved and they have an input into the process. And so we sort of outlined what that could look like using COBIT and some other standards that are readily available. But again, to your point, internalizing as to what it means for industrial, not just here's risk management, everybody should be able to do this.
Okay, I have about 3 tangents I want to go on, but I'm going to try to stay on track here.
All right.
The next area I want to talk to you a little bit about is the risk equation, which you are suggesting a slight tweak to.
Yes.
And we'll put that up, but it's industrial cyber risk equals consequence times threat times vulnerability, which a lot of times you'll see as likelihood, threat times vulnerability. But then the new twist is you divide that threat times vulnerability by resilience.
Yep.
And maybe tell me why you added that in there, and give me an example of what would fall under something that provided resilience that would be applicable to the formula.
Sure. And again, this is not necessarily a new thought. The editing of the risk equation to be able to add some sort of component of capacity to respond has been in different variations of it over the past decade or so. And so really just being able to hone on it again from the industrial side is that it links back to a lot of the conversations that I know that you've already had, and others definitely watching the show would have had with regards to how does ISA describe it when we talk about cyber PHAs? Even most recently with CCE, right? There's this conversation about what are the engineering controls that we have in place. And the idea here is that if we add more resilience through passive safety mechanisms, through sort of these engineering controls, then we can start looking at cyber risk as, again, not just the security portion, the ICS network, but also the physics of the process, the things that we have embedded that protect our processes. And the more that we add to that, because it's in the denominator of that, we could actually decrease risk, right? Because the consequence may stay the same, right? The big boom, the bad thing that could happen, that's going to be the same environmental high impact, maybe the property damage, business continuity, all of that. But the threats and vulnerabilities, when we look at that sort of objectively, we see vulnerabilities are doing nothing but increasing. And we have nothing but increasing on the threat side too. So how could we control that? Well, we look then at the resilience side of the equation. And so that addition came from disaster recovery equations that already exist, some other risk management processes that exist, and trying to make that, again, be about the physics and not just about the security. And I think to your point earlier, it brings that VP of operations and engineering into the equation a little bit stronger than otherwise.
But I guess I always thought of it as, and from a formula standpoint, it doesn't matter if you put it under consequence or
Yeah.
under threat times vulnerability. But I always thought of it as consequence reduction, and maybe it's because I have CCE on the brain or something like that. But if, for example, let's say I change my recovery so that I
Yeah.
can recover in 6 hours instead of 6 days. Now,
Yep.
the consequence of that event has now reduced, right? Down to whatever the impact is of a 6 hour outage as opposed to a 6 day outage. Or if I put a safety measure, an unhackable safety measure in place that can't cause this thing to explode, well, now my consequence of that cyber attack has now been reduced. But you seem to put it under the likelihood side of it. Are there some likelihood resilience areas that would fit in, or is it just really not an issue? Maybe it's
Well,
making something out of nothing. But to me, it seems more consequence reduction than likelihood reduction.
I think it's a good that's a good discussion to have. So let's explore that a little bit. So absolutely, it's pulled out of the equation in a spotlight fashion when we did this. When we took resilience and put it right there, that was done on purpose to be able to say
Mm-hmm.
there's something you can do proactively, because bearing it in the equation just makes it seem like you're up to fate, right? You're up to whether or not the threat
Mm-hmm.
adversary's got the capability and the motivation. What vulnerabilities have you played whack-a-mole with your mitigation plans? And so by bringing it out, we really wanted to make sure that everybody can understand that you're sort of got some control on this that you can do. So whether or not it's under consequence or under likelihood, I think is probably indifferent. I think you could put it under one or the other. Vulnerabilities, we know that we can do something about. I think that we see as pendulum swing back and forth over the past couple of decades. We used to say threat is equal to a one, and then everybody just did mitigations nonstop, a la NERC-CIP, versus where we're sitting now, which is, well, we need a little bit more threat discussions to be able to inform risk and prioritization. And so that's why I think we put it on that side of the equation. But to your point, it could probably go under consequence just as well too.
Mm. Okay. And I guess there could be some measures, some resilience that could potentially reduce the likelihood. For example, if you have redundant systems, in theory, that is providing some resilience. How much you're actually getting in a cyber incident is less clear, because the
Yeah.
same attack could take out both. That's where I think in the ICS world, sometimes that's confusing. We run into a lot of people that think their system is very resilient because they haven't ever had an outage and they've planned for all sorts of redundancies against, let's say, human error or I guess component failure or
Yep.
weather incident or things like that, but not against intentional cyber attacks that are a little different.
Right. Like
Uh,
we have an SIS. We don't have to worry about, a big bad day. It's on the same network as your PCN, as your process control network. Like, oh, that's probably not going to be as resilient as you think it is.
but I do take your point that breaking it out as a separate item, wherever you put it, has some value, because then you can say, we have gone from this very high consequence event. We have spent some money, because this is all time and money, right? These are resources. We have
Yep.
spent some money to add these resources, add this resilience, and the result to our risk can be seen in the equation exactly this way, as opposed to burying it. So I didn't think about that. I think that's a really good answer. Now, maybe a tougher question is threat,
Okay.
which, full disclosure here, Dragos is very active in the threat world. You do a tremendous amount of threat research. You publish a lot on threats. You have threat intel feeds that you charge for. So you live and breathe this threat world and have a stake in it. You mentioned in the paper that threat was, in the past, just said, well, let's just make it one. And that, again, is, some people still say that, actually. I still
Yep.
hear that. But to me, that seems like a cop-out. I would hate to go to executive management with that argument and say,
Yep.
oh, we're just going to call it one. They're going to say, well, then you're not going to get any money because you're not doing the work. But first of all, how do you define threat in this risk equation? Do you try to do it on a scale of 1 to 5? What does that numerator of threat look like
Yeah.
from
So
a calculation?
what's been interesting with working with different organizations going through this process is they use numbers that make sense to them. So there's a reason why in the paper we didn't assign numerical values. I know that CCE, for example, assigned a weighting value. We didn't do that for this because we have some utilities that already have an enterprise risk management process, and they may report to the board on a 0 to 7 integer or a 5x5 heat map. And so there does need to be this conversation of any risk equation that you use. I really don't want industrial organizations to reinvent the wheel, to create a new scoring criteria just for industrial risk, because it goes back to then, why are we different? And I want them to adapt to what's already successfully being presented to the board or to the CEO and leverage that. So we didn't put numerical values there, but I will tell you that I have worked with organizations that have done 0 to 5, have done another heat map on top of it. And so I think that is really up to where your granularity lies with reporting metrics up to executives on risk. Now, that said, when I look at the threat piece itself, it really is, are the capabilities out there that we are noticing from Intel feeds or from just Google and newspapers, whatever it is that you're using to ingest the threat information. So do we see capabilities? Do we see motivations that target our sector, our region, ourselves, right? So what are we doing to be able to OSINT ourselves, right? Open source intelligence gathering, even, again, not promoting any products or anything like that, just to say, are you aware? And if you are aware, you then have this idea of being able to turn that bit up or down, depending on what it is that you're noticing. If you start seeing, for example, that you're in the chemical sector and you start noticing that there are more threat adversaries targeting chemical sector, then maybe some of these risks that you've been noticing should get a little bit of a bump up. And it's really allowing the organization to prioritize. I think at the end of the day, when we think about risk, it's not a predictive tool, right? We're not using it for prediction. Humans suck at prediction. We don't do that well at all. But what we do okay at is interpreting other data and saying, well, based off of the data that I'm seeing, this is sort of either the gut reaction, or with more data, I can be more precise with it to get you to a better comfort spot, either the executive suite or beyond. So that's really what the threat conversation's meant. It's not that threat is equal to a 1. I think even when you talk to Andy, right, it's that it's non-zero, right? So if we have a playroom between 1 and non-zero, what does that playroom look like? And it's really based off of what we notice from capabilities, focus on the sector, focus on your organization, or focus on your region.
When you say you've seen people have something and you don't want them to change it just to implement what you're talking about here, I think that makes a lot of sense. I haven't seen, though, someone break out threats separately. And maybe it's because I don't play much in the IT world and I just haven't seen it used effectively yet in OT. I've seen these business risk matrix that will have the various high, medium, low on one axis, and then we'll have, let's say, 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000, and they'll have likelihood typically across, I guess, the x-axis that would be. But I haven't seen them break out threat. They've just said this is the likelihood of it happening. Are you seeing some cases where companies are actually breaking out those components of threat and vulnerability separately? And are they doing that in IT, or are they doing that corporately?
So it's only for, I would say, IT and the ICS security risk.
Okay.
When you look at likelihood from the perspective of other types of risks, right, safety or finance being chief among them, what they'll typically do is have a statistical model that they'll run to be able to say, and they'll even track their model risk too, right? Like the risk of their model being wrong. But they'll run a statistical model that will say, well, based off of the frequency of events, here's what we're seeing. The reason that you see threat and vulnerabilities used in discussion for IT or industrial cyber risk is because those aren't statistically modelable, because it's not talking about, well, what's the hurricane data that we have? What's the natural disaster data that we have? Instead, we're dealing with a adversary who's deliberately intending to do something. So all the frequency data throws out the window, because it's not like a hurricane that I can easily say, well, here are the amount that we have over a 10-year period. We can't use that frequency data as well. So what you find out, and I think that Aaron even talked about this S4 a couple of years ago, is when you look at that overall discussion of intentional risk, it's looking at terrorism, it's looking at models that they have for piracy on the high seas, right? And looking at those intentional models are very different than the models that we have for hurricanes or earthquakes. And that's where you see more threat and vulnerability conversations come out from corporate risk.
Right. That makes sense. area where I think I've had the most discussions with Rob when it comes to threat, Rob Lee of Dragos, your founder, isn't that it's highly useful. It is. I just wonder if it's tactically, I have no doubt that it's useful. At the right point in your maturity and your ICS
Yep.
security program, tactically, it makes sense that you now have these other things done. You're now able to take and use this information and adapt your program very quickly as you see different threats come in from a tactical standpoint. I'm wondering about threat intel from a strategic risk management standpoint. Does the threat really change that much, or is this something you just check in every 6 months or a year, or are you actually expecting people in their risk management program to be looking at these things as they come in from yourselves or other people?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Risk managers know, right? I mean, the risk manager is probably sitting somewhere else in the organization. Every like once a year, somebody taps on the shoulder and says, "Hey, we need a new insurance policy. We need you to update the risk register. What does that look like?" And from their perspective, they should absolutely be aware of the equation and how it is that it's being used on a day-to-day basis. So the way I describe it is that vulnerability management, threat management have daily activities, right?
Mm-hmm.
Vulnerability management, I mean, hopefully not as daily, unless you're doing 35-day patching cycles with NERC SIP. But when we think about the threats, it's more monitoring threats. And every once in a while, there'll be a threat or a vulnerability that is reaching the newspapers or that is going to be elevated to an executive discussion. And in that case, it would get elevated through the risk register and communication processes that you would hopefully have. And also use your committees that would include the stakeholders that you're concerned with. And that sort of elevation will bring the additional maturity and conversation around, oh, we just saw Trisis as an event that happened. What should we do? Is this something that the board should care about, that the CEO should talk about? What's the focus point for us as an organization? And if you're scrambling, you're going to have a very bad time of it. And that's where the paper really suggests have these ideas of threat profiles where you could easily access, here's threat information about us, our sector, our region, capabilities out there, but also be able to have that mature conversation of we're resilient, we're managing vulnerabilities, here's the consequence, so that you could give that as sort of an offering to the executives when they ask for it.
I understand the communication side of it, and that's so important with the amount of FUD out there, right? A lot of times you're explaining to them why this doesn't change the risk landscape when you're seeing this article of the week that comes out. But I guess I'm wondering if you've got these profiles, are you changing those very often?
No.
Are those something that are changed once a year or just reviewed yearly, or what do you do on those?
Yeah, it's probably anywhere from a 6-month to 12-month cycle.
Okay.
I think it depends on how mature the organization is. I don't think that anything that's in risk management needs to be a high touch all the time, right? Because you're not briefing it all the time. If you're lucky, you go up to the executive suite and you get like a slide that maybe is broken up into 4 quadrants of everything you've done in the past year. So that the risk profiles, the threat profiles and the risk register would have to get updated at a frequency, but that frequency is most likely dictated by how often these committees meet, how often does your executives ask about industrial cyber risk that you can put that on their radar.
So then a threat intel feed would help you with those updates, right? Help you create the original one, help you with the updates. And after that, it doesn't typically have much of an impact on a tactical level.
Right, on the risk side, right? So
yes.
Again, the risk manager is not taking up the feeds. Somebody from the intel department is hopefully interpreting some of that for the risk manager, because that risk manager is also looking at a whole lot of other risks, and they wouldn't have the specialty to be able to understand maybe some of the nuances and intel reports and things of that nature. So you're absolutely right. From a tactical, here's the strategy we push to the executives. That's not going to be a day-to-day for them. Now, I do think that there are going to be some conversations on the intel side for internal teams where maybe you're looking at, again, OSINTing yourself, looking at pastebin sites. Again, even if you do or do not use an intel service, to be able to do it on yourself so you have a good idea of what of my information's out there that adversaries may have access to, and how do I sort of understand the threats in my sector. And that will help elevate the conversation with the risk manager when they come up on that annual or 6-month basis.
But I think ideally that's just feeding in some type of control you have, whether it's
Yes.
a process control or a technical control. It's saying, I have this information, I have this control to help deal with it. Now that helps me tune or tweak or investigate what I've already got in place.
Yeah, and that's all I care. I mean, I shouldn't say that's all that executives care about. When you talk about threats, executives tend to want to know a lot about threats, and I think it's because it's cool, right? There's a lot of cool things that they can think about from a movie perspective. They can talk about Die Hard 4, and like that's some cool stuff. But from a what does it matter to the business perspective, 9 times out of 10, they mostly care about how does it impact our business. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's always great to go down rabbit holes, executives, on threats and things that are happening in the industry. But simultaneously, their number one charge at the end of the day is keep the process running, keep the lights on. What does that mean? So what do I care about this threat for really at the end of the day?
Isn't there always one executive on the board or there who tracks this closely and calls you about every every
Yes,
single incident and wants to know 10
absolutely.
times 10 times more detail than they should? It's like, hey, this is not what you have to worry about, but they love it. There's always one or
Yes,
two
it's
like that.
cool. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
definitely got the
Yeah.
cool factor for it. But again, for the business, what does it mean for them and their processes is really the
Yeah.
key message.
Okay. I want to try to hit two more things here in the time we have left. One is just quickly your step 4, and this document has a set of steps and guides for each step. We're not stepping through those. As I said, a lot of those are very traditional risk management
Yep.
activities with a sprinkling of ICS uniqueness to them. But we should probably talk about step 4, risk evaluation. And you talk about 3 different types: an
Yep.
architecture review, a qualitative risk evaluation, and a quantitative risk analysis. Practically, what are you recommending to people? Let's say people that have done the basics, so they have a basic ICS security program in place.
Yep.
Maybe not bringing in all this information and processing it, but what level of risk evaluation should they be doing
So
of
the
those
way that
3?
it's sort of laid out is that figure 3 is a waterfall, right? And so
Right.
everyone should get, and we're doing this really well right now. I would say you actually had a great piece talking about maturity based versus risk based, and everyone is doing something with architecture reviews, and they may not call it that. They may just say I'm adhering to a standard, or they're doing some sort of checklist, but they're looking at best practices or common practices and comparing it to what it is that they have, doing some sort of gap analysis and bridging that gap. Every industrial site should have that, right? That's just a very common sense. Everyone needs to start there. What then becomes difficult, because we're I think as an industry just starting to get into a risk management conversation, is,
Mm-hmm.
well, what do I do next? Like, I don't know if this remote access solution is the right one. How do I compare this to another, or do I even need remote access? How do I discuss this to anybody outside of my department? That requires you to then talk about risk, and that's where we say start off with heat maps are horrible, heat maps are dead, long live heat maps, right? We will always have them. And
Yes.
so the qualitative risk analysis is that heat map approach. It uses the impact criteria that we just talked about, right? So environmental impacts, financial, business continuity. So you can start having an idea of where does this sit in the giant universe of risk. It will be subjective. It won't be precise, but it will at least give you a gut check and a very easy conversation to start off with on risk. The more extreme conversations are, how do I quantify this now? Like, I really want to have a quantifiable measure. For some organizations, that means, to your point, dollar values, right? They may go through and look at, well, what's the impact that this could be from a dollar value perspective? And they want to treat that as I want to know the likelihood a little bit. I want to understand, because you can't say extremes like this is going to be a $250 million risk. If it's not based in reality of what could happen, then that will never go anywhere. So there needs to be a conversation about quantification that's a little bit more mature. We work with different organizations that may use IT-centric processes. So there's some IT standards out there that quantify. They're not great in industrial for the obvious reasons. One of the things that they do, for example, do analyze loss expectancies.
Mm-hmm.
ALEs are not great for us, right? It's like, what's the ALE on that turbine? Oh, it's 10%. That you're going to lose 10% value from a hack every year. It makes no sense. So they have to massage what that means for them. And we see a lot of organizations just starting on quantification for industrial and just getting mature around it. So with that, those should only be the really high top risks, right? Maybe you're only looking, if you've got 50 facilities, maybe 2 facilities are going through that quantification, and everything else is getting a myriad of gray between the qualification heat map and everything getting an architecture review.
It's a difficult subject because we've actually at S4, we've had that author, his name escapes me, who wrote How to Measure Everything.
Yes,
Yes.
Syerson, yeah.
How to measure anything or everything in cyber security risk. I've looked
Except for
at
industrial.
FAIR. I've looked at the FAIR process
Yep.
or methodology. And there's a lot of appeal to it. I think that's where I'd like to go, but I always worry anytime we do quantitative that it implies a level of precision that isn't there.
Yep.
And then when you look
Agreed.
at the actual level of precision, it's not that much different than qualitative. If you can say, "Oh, I can estimate it with plus or minus 20%," why not just do 1 to 5 and call it qualitative? So I haven't really seen a compelling argument as to why quantitative would work. Do you think we'll get there in the future? I mean, are we 5 years from now? Are we going to be able to do quantitative?
I hope so. I've seen some organizations try to use quantitative. Again, FAIR is an example, right? Where they've used it because it has an ontology that is very structured, that they can then discuss things, and it standardizes the conversation. I think that you're absolutely right in the falsehood of precision, though. If you go to an executive and you say that this is going to be 250,734,011 they're gonna see that 11 cents and they're just gonna keep poking at it. They're going to drill until the 11 cents falls away, because at a certain point, you're going to use a magic calculator. And once the 11 cents falls away, then they're questioning everything you've ever presented to them on. Right. And so you then lose that reputational gain that you'd have had otherwise. So I think with where I've seen quantification work in organizations has been if they're already quantifying other areas of risk and they can go and have an open conversation about our model may be wrong. Right? Like, we'll start this conversation and it may be just a little bit more fanciful, a little bit more data driven than qualification of the heat map. But I want everybody to know that we're going to change this metric maybe in 2 or 3 years. We're going to grow with this. And if executives understand that, then I see them far more accepting of, well, these values may have a little bit of fudge in them and we need to work that out over time.
Okay. Yeah. It's a tough issue. It really is.
I hope that we get there. I really want to see us get there. I think that we've done it in a little bit better fashion with safety, for example. But again, safety's got statistical models that we don't have.
Sure.
We won't get there. So how comfortable are we without statistical models and also wanting to quantify something?
Well, and with intentional malicious attacks, when you don't have the data and then you have to throw in the human element that can change like that, you can all of a sudden be under a sustained attack from a well-resourced, highly motivated adversary when you weren't the day before. So I don't know how you do that.
And again, it's not for prediction; it's for communication.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I want to get to your heat map then. So this is, let's see, this is your figure 4, and I'll put it up on the screen here so people can see it. I was confused by this. So I understand the concept, and I understand maybe on the left side you show an increasing threat motivation. I can understand how you could map that out. And on the right side you have decreased capacity for resilience. I guess I need a little, why don't we start there? What does a decreased capacity for resilience mean?
So we've seen that with a couple of examples, right? Where we've had, for example, where maybe you had a man in the middle or a woman in the middle is going out to a site to turn a valve, to take measurements, and to passively keep an element in place. And we saw a lot of sites over the past decade start taking out those people, having a new project maybe that gets installed with remote access. And all of a sudden, where we tracked our resiliency is no longer there. And so it's very similar to our conversation we had before about maybe that's decreasing the impact, right? So if I took that risk equation and this is what the heat map's showing me, instead of saying, well, I'm gonna move my consequence needle over a little bit, instead I'm gonna track this on the other side of this heat map and say, well, we've just gotten rid of a resilience element, an engineering control or otherwise, and therefore this needs to be a higher risk than it was before. Or maybe it's a planned project that we're now going to have to track at a higher risk than it was before.
So it is talking about resilience changing over time.
Yes, and it
Is the
could be
time
again.
element to it. Okay.
Yes. So it could be that it could be project based. It could be that we've got a new capacity that we didn't have before. All of those things could be sort of reviewed on, again, an annual basis every 6 months. Projects in our space take, years. So it's definitely got a longer lag time than most.
Okay, then when we get to the actual heat map itself, normally what I'll see is just, for example, the half on the left that shows things getting much more serious as you move up and to the right. But here you also have a chart on the left, and then you've got arrows. So maybe explain to me how I'm supposed to read this, because I've tried.
Right.
I'm really lost on this. I think there's something
So
here I'm missing.
it's just two heat maps, right? Where if I take the one that's about resilience, I just flipped it around. That's all. That's all that took
Yeah.
place there. So if I wanted to track risks on two different heat maps, I'd have one that's about threat and one that's about resilience. Combining them just makes it simple from a reporting value. We've seen a couple of executives gravitate towards a heat map where they can understand resilience again called out separately. And that's why it's sort of an inversed one and it's attached to the same one, as opposed to here's two heat maps about the exact same risk. If you move that needle about resilience, then you're going to have a different impact than you would have had otherwise. So it's not meant to be read those two heat maps differently if you want to. You could flip the resilience one all the way around, and then it'll make more sense. But then when you map it and show it, you could place it on one axis that shows that the impacts are coming towards high impact in the center. Decrease in resiliency, unfortunately, points up. I couldn't make the arrows do that. And increase in motivation or capability of the threat is on the left-hand side.
I think I know where I got a mistake here. I have two spots in this heat map. Is that correct? I fill two squares?
Yes.
Or do I fill one square?
You can fill in two squares. You could absolutely do that. And I've also seen folks use one, but that one is definitely like there's some mental gymnastics involved if you have one, right? Because you're like trying to average two things together. Well, the threat is increasing, but my resilience is decreasing. That gets a little funky. But yes, you could have two on there at the same time.
Well, I would think I would have to, because I would have
Map resilience and
a threat motivation reading and a threat reading, and that would put me in one square on the left side, and then I would have a resilience capability and a change to resilience, and that would be on the right side. Oh, okay. It's actually two heat maps shown in one diagram is what it is. Okay.
Absolutely.
And then how would you say someone should read that then if they filled in two squares? Let's say they went through the trouble of doing that. Do they average the two, or what do they do?
So I've seen people average them because they're then trying to track a number that is where's my threat versus where's my resiliency. And if they can report that across all, then you can start seeing some interesting trend data of where the threat's increasing versus some projects that we're maybe doing that are decreasing resilience. And that's where the only time I've seen averaging be successful is if they're doing it to trend towards something, right? Otherwise, averaging just means I have a score, and scores are as interpretive as you want them to be.
They are, but they also, if they're consistently calculated, they can provide priority, which again has been a huge issue with me on this efficient risk reduction drive. Is you need to know, even if the numbers make no sense, if you can say this is bigger than that, that's valuable to an organization at some point.
Yes. I've done some presentations on metrics, and the way I describe them is that your first metrics will be awesome because you'll be measuring something, but they're also going to suck. Like you're going to have to revise them over time. And the only way you're going to get better at them is by noticing trends, right? And so from noticing one number is bigger than another, maybe after 3 years, you say that number needs to actually be something that's more granular for me. And then you'll have to interpret that to yourself again.
Well, and where you're going to draw the line, right? Your risk acceptance line or whatever you decide to do there is another fun thing to do. Although the heat maps the heat maps, whether they're well done or not, tend to lead to that decision. They essentially say when we're at this color in our heat map, we have to do something. And at this color or below, we can accept it. I guess I still have one question on this. So the arrows on the left and the right that talk about increased threat motivation, decreased capacity for resilience, does that imply, is that something that, let's say I had a high threat and it went lower, my threat went lower. Would that then mean I had a decreased I would go lower in increased threat motivation. Am I tracking on those y-axis is, I guess, maybe a better way to put the question.
Yeah.
Is that tracking movement or change?
Yes. So in the hypothetical, if I had no longer interest from threat adversaries, which would be an interesting conversation. We'd have to track how you're finding that. But let's say you're at the very top, right? The very top row of that threat side, meaning motivation. Then you're measuring impact, which I think has got a 20%, a 40%, 60%, 80% value. So let's say I'm at the 40%, and my CEO said something stupid, and all of a sudden I've got a new activity group that was looking at me that wasn't before. And I'm not saying nation states, maybe another hacktivist group or something. And it's been a couple of years, and we haven't seen any activity, or any activity we saw was being thwarted, and we're monitoring things. Then maybe there's a valid conversation about, well, that 40% maybe it decreases to the next value rung down, which would be 32%. And to your point, there are activities that we do for monitoring threats that maybe we're no longer briefing as actively as we were before. Maybe we're only monitoring on a quarterly basis as opposed to a monthly basis. There are interpretations about what you have to do if you're a green, yellow, red, when you do qualification that wouldn't be part of that equation.
Okay, the paper itself, and let me put up the title of it again here, Industrial Cyber Risk Management, a Guideline for Operational Technology. It's definitely worth a read. There was a lot of things that we didn't cover in there that I would say some of it is Risk Management 101, and some of it is definitions and things of that nature. Was there an important part of the paper that we didn't talk about that you think, hey, listeners, viewers of this, you should really understand this part because this is what most people get wrong, or this is where we're adding additional value?
I think the value conversation is stemming from a lot of the discussions that a lot of us in ICS security have been having for the past couple of decades now, and not really knowing how to verbalize it. And what we've seen become the actionable thing is we look at certain industrial organizations and they're spending more on website security than they are on securing their plant. And how do you have that conversation about where to track these risks is what this paper is trying to help folks with, so that you could have the same conversation with IT security as OT security, as financial security, as safety security, right? So that all these risk elements are brought together and we're speaking the same language, that risk is equal to risk equal to risk, that we're just using the same terminologies, we understand each other a little bit better. And I think that's really the main driver for a report like this.
Well, and just one last thought on that. The reason they spend more money on that website or that internal server or any of these small little projects is because operations and OT has been so bad at explaining risk and getting budget. And those two skills are highly related. I've always told people in operations when they say we can't afford this, and I look at the number and it's so small compared to the IT budget, I say, you really got to get your hands on the IT budget and see what they're spending,
and how they're
total
discussing
amount, and the things that they're buying with that money. I said, you would just laugh that, or you'd be crushed that you haven't been more successful in getting money. So this risk management is a large part about getting budget to do
1,000%,
right?
Yeah. And I'd urge people to look at the risk register. If they don't have any time to look at the rest of the paper, the risk register towards the end of the paper there has actually got examples of what this discussion could be. And it talks about the impacts. It talks about also cost benefit analysis, right? Like, what do I have to spend to manage this risk? And if you're looking at, for a lot of us industrial spaces, we're looking at risks that are millions, if not tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. So when you go back and ask for maybe a few $100,000, that suddenly has a much better conversation than, well, I don't know what this will cost the company. I have no idea how this will help you. It'll help us meet a standard. It's not going to be the risk-based conversation we need to have with executives.
Well, Jason, I want to thank you for being on the show and also for writing this great paper. We'll make sure we link to it in the show notes, and look forward to seeing you in person in not too distance of a future. We got some events coming up, so I think we're going to be back traveling and seeing each other before too long.
Awesome. I look forward to it, Dale. Thank you very much.